harvest season had just begun in a quiet farming valley in Iowa. Combines moved slowly through golden cornfields, and grain trucks lined up outside the small-town elevator before sunrise. Just outside town, a farm equipment auction was drawing its usual crowd of farmers looking for spare parts and cheap machinery. Near the back of the lot sat an old John Deere tractor, its green paint faded and its tires half flat. Most people walked past it without a second glance. The local John Deere dealer stood nearby joking with a few farmers, saying the machine was probably worth more as scrap metal than as a working tractor. That's when a quiet farmer named Ethan Miller stopped and looked at it longer than anyone else had. When he offered $600, the dealer laughed. A few farmers in the crowd chuckled too. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded, paid cash, and hauled the tractor home. Most people forgot about that moment by the next morning. But 12 years later, the same dealer would stand inside Ethan's barn, staring at that same tractor, wondering how he had missed what was hiding inside it.
Ethan Miller had grown up on a small 140-acre farm just outside a quiet town in eastern Iowa. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather started the farm after returning from military service in the late 1960s, clearing the first fields himself and building the original barn with help from neighbors. By the time Ethan was a child, the farm was modest but steady. Most years they planted corn and soybeans, rotating the fields the same way Ethan's father had learned decades earlier. Ethan's earliest memories weren't of school or sports. They were of sitting beside his father in the cab of an old tractor before sunrise, watching the headlights stretch across rows of soil while the engine hummed steadily. Their equipment was never new. Most of the machines on the farm were already 15 or 20 years old, bought second-hand from auctions or retiring farmers. Ethan's father always said something that stuck with him. If you understand a machine, it'll serve you longer than a loan ever will. So when something broke, they didn't replace it. They opened the hood. By the time Ethan was 14, he could rebuild small engines, replace hydraulic hoses, and recognize mechanical problems just by listening to the sound of a tractor running in the yard. While many farmers in the area were starting to upgrade to expensive modern equipment, Ethan quietly developed a different habit. He studied old machines. Winter evenings often found him in the workshop flipping through old John Deere repair manuals, trying to understand why certain engines were designed the way they were. Neighbors sometimes joked that Ethan ran a farm full of museum pieces, but Ethan never argued with them, because what interested him wasn't the age of the machines. It was the possibility that someone, somewhere in the past, had already tried something different. And sometimes those forgotten ideas were still hiding in places nobody thought to look anymore. By the time Ethan Miller turned 32, farming had become very different from the way his grandfather had done it. Across the county, farms were getting bigger, equipment was getting faster, stronger, and far more expensive. New tractors at the John Deere dealership in town were selling for $90,000 to $120,000. Some of the larger models cost even more. Combines were approaching $300,000. For large operations, those machines made sense, but Ethan's farm was still just 140 acres. That meant every purchase had to be carefully considered. For years, Ethan had relied on an older tractor from the late 1980s as his main field machine. It had planted corn, pulled wagons, and handled most of the heavy work on the farm. But that year, during early spring field preparation, something began to change. The transmission started slipping. At first, it happened only occasionally, then it became more frequent. Hydraulic pressure dropped during long hours in the field. One afternoon, the tractor stalled completely while pulling a cultivator across one of the soybean fields. Ethan managed to restart it, but he knew what the problem meant. A full transmission rebuild could cost $7,000 to $9,000. Buying a newer tractor would cost far more. Neighbors offered advice the way farmers always do. Most of them suggested the same thing. Time to trade up. Several farmers in the area had recently financed newer tractors through the dealership. 5-year payment plans were becoming common, but Ethan had always been careful about debt. Crop yields changed from year to year. Weather could erase profits in a single season. Taking on large payments for equipment made him uneasy. Then, late that summer, a farm equipment auction was announced just outside town. Auctions like that often included old tractors, broken machinery, and equipment farmers no longer wanted to repair. Most people attended hoping to find spare parts. Ethan went for a different reason. He was hoping to find something simple, something mechanical, something he could fix himself. That's when he noticed the tractor sitting near the back of the lot, an old John Deere machine from the 1970s, faded green paint, nearly gray with age. The tires were worn, the engine hadn't been started in years. The dealership mechanic standing nearby joked loudly that the machine was worth more as scrap than as a working tractor. Several farmers laughed. Most people walked past it without slowing down, but Ethan stopped. He crouched beside the tractor, opened the side panel, and looked inside the engine compartment longer than anyone else had, because something inside that engine didn't look the way it was supposed to, and in that moment, Ethan realized something that nobody else at that auction seemed to notice. The tractor arrived at Ethan Miller's farm late that afternoon, riding on a flatbed trailer behind his pickup. Dust from the auction yard still clung to the faded green paint, and one of the rear tires barely held enough air to keep the rim off the ground. To most people, it looked exactly like what the dealer had called it earlier that day: scrap. Ethan parked the tractor beside his workshop barn and left it there until the evening chores were finished. The sun had already started dropping behind the grain bins when he finally walked back toward it with a small toolbox in his hand. The barn lights flickered on. For the next hour, Ethan simply looked. He opened the side engine panel again, the same one he had glanced inside at the auction. The engine was dusty, but surprisingly intact. Many of the components were original. But there were small details that didn't quite match the standard layout he remembered from the manuals he had studied years earlier. A fuel line had been rerouted in an unusual way. One of the metal components near the injection system looked like it had been hand-machined, not factory-produced. Someone, many years ago, had clearly taken the engine apart and changed something. Ethan wiped grease away from the metal surface and leaned closer under the workshop light. That's when he noticed something else. A small set of numbers scratched into the side of the modified part. Not a serial number, not a manufacturer's mark. Just a few rough markings, almost like a mechanic's personal notes. Ethan stood there quietly for a moment. Outside, the farmyard was silent except for the distant sound of grain dryers running on neighboring farms. Most farmers would have stopped there. A tractor with unknown modifications could easily become an expensive mistake. But Ethan wasn't thinking about resale value. He was thinking about possibility. Someone had clearly tried something different with this engine. Maybe it had failed. Maybe that was why the tractor ended up forgotten at an auction. But Ethan couldn't ignore the thought forming in his mind. What if the idea had never been finished? That winter, after harvest was over and the fields were quiet under frost, Ethan made a decision. Instead of scrapping the tractor or selling it for parts, he was going to rebuild the entire machine himself. And more importantly, he was going to figure out exactly what the previous mechanic had been trying to do inside that engine. At the time, it looked like nothing more than a winter project, but the real story of that tractor had barely begun. That winter became the beginning of a long, slow process. Ethan didn't rush into tearing the tractor apart immediately. For the first few weeks, he simply studied it. Each evening, after finishing chores, he walked into the workshop, turned on the overhead lights, and opened the same engine panel again. The old John Deere manuals from his shelf slowly began to pile up on the workbench. Something about the engine still didn't make sense. The basic structure was original, but a few small components had clearly been changed by someone who understood engines very well. The modified fuel line wasn't random. The injection timing looked slightly adjusted, and that strange hand-machined part near the fuel system continued to bother him. But there was no documentation explaining what the previous mechanic had attempted. So Ethan did the only thing he could do. He began rebuilding the tractor piece by piece. First came the obvious problems. The fuel pump seals had completely dried out. Two of the pistons showed signs of wear. Several hoses cracked the moment he touched them. By late January, the tractor engine was sitting in parts across the workbench. Most farmers would have considered the situation a mistake by that point. The rebuild alone was already costing more than the tractor itself. Replacement parts added up quickly. New seals, piston rings, hydraulic fittings, a rebuilt starter motor. By the time Ethan finished ordering everything he needed, he had spent nearly $1,800. That was still far cheaper than buying another tractor, but there was no guarantee the machine would even run. Meanwhile, the story of Ethan's $600 tractor had quietly spread through the farming community. Neighbors stopped by occasionally during the winter months. Some were curious, others came mostly to laugh. One farmer stood in the doorway of the workshop one evening and shook his head while looking at the engine parts spread across the table. "You know," he said, "for what you're spending fixing that thing, you could have bought something that actually runs." Ethan didn't argue. He just kept working. By early March, the engine was finally reassembled. The first startup attempt happened on a cold morning while a thin layer of frost still covered the fields. Ethan connected the battery, turned the key. The engine coughed once, then went silent again. Second attempt. Nothing. Third attempt. The engine sputtered for a moment before dying again. For several days, the tractor refused to start properly. Fuel pressure wasn't stable. The timing seemed off. The strange, modified component inside the engine complicated every adjustment Ethan tried to make. At one point, he considered removing the modified part completely and returning the engine to its original design. That would have been the safer decision, but something about the craftsmanship of the part kept him from doing it. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. The design looked intentional, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that removing it might erase the real purpose of the engine. So, instead of removing it, he began studying it more carefully. Night after night he adjusted small details: fuel timing, injection pressure, air intake balance. Most changes made the engine worse, but slowly something began to happen. One evening in early April, after several weeks of adjustments, the engine started and stayed running. The sound was rough at first, uneven, almost hesitant, but it was running. Ethan let the engine idle for nearly 20 minutes while watching the temperature gauge carefully. No overheating, oil pressure stable. That alone felt like a small victory. But the real test came a few weeks later, during the start of planting season. Ethan attached the tractor to a small planter and drove it slowly into the first field. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, after about an hour of work, a new problem appeared. The engine temperature climbed higher than expected. Not dangerously high, but enough to worry him. Over the next few weeks, the tractor proved both promising and frustrating at the same time. Some days it ran smoothly. Other days it struggled. Fuel consumption numbers didn't match anything Ethan expected. Sometimes the tractor burned fuel faster than it should. Other times it seemed unusually efficient. Nothing about the engine's behavior was consistent. Neighbors who heard the tractor running often joked about it. One of them once laughed across the fence and said, "That thing sounds like it's arguing with itself." Ethan simply nodded, because in a way it was. Inside that engine, an idea from decades earlier was trying to work, but the final piece of the puzzle was still missing, and Ethan had no idea yet what that missing piece was. That first planting season with the rebuilt tractor didn't bring any dramatic breakthroughs. The machine worked, but only just well enough to justify the time Ethan had spent rebuilding it. Some days the engine ran smoothly for hours. Other days it felt unpredictable, almost as if it couldn't decide how it wanted to behave. Fuel usage remained the biggest mystery. Sometimes the tractor burned more diesel than Ethan expected from a machine its size. Other times, the fuel gauge barely moved after several hours in the field. At first, Ethan assumed the numbers were simply inconsistent. But he had a habit his father had taught him years earlier. He kept records. Every evening after shutting down the tractor, Ethan wrote down a few simple details in a small notebook kept in the workshop. Hours worked, gallons of fuel added, field conditions. At the time, it felt like routine bookkeeping, but those small notes would slowly begin revealing something unexpected. 1 year later, the tractor had become a regular part of the farm again. It wasn't Ethan's most powerful machine, but it was dependable enough for many daily jobs. And the fuel numbers were starting to show a pattern. The tractor consistently used slightly less fuel per acre than his other equipment. Not dramatically less, just enough to notice. Ethan assumed it might be due to careful driving habits or lighter workloads, but he kept writing down the numbers anyway. 3 seasons later, the pattern had become harder to ignore. The tractor was now using roughly 20% less fuel than most machines of similar size. Ethan began paying closer attention to the strange modification inside the engine again. He adjusted the fuel timing slightly, cleaned the injector system. The improvements were small, but they were real. Neighbors still joked about the old tractor. From the outside, it didn't look impressive at all. The faded green paint had grown duller over time. The cab had no modern electronics. Compared to the newer tractors in the area, Ethan's machine looked like something from another era. But inside the engine, something unusual was happening. 5 years later, the tractor had become Ethan's most economical machine. His notebooks now showed something remarkable. Fuel usage was nearly 30% lower than comparable tractors doing the same work. Ethan still wasn't completely sure why, but he had a growing theory. The old mechanic who had modified the engine years ago may have been experimenting with combustion efficiency, adjusting the fuel system to burn diesel more completely. At the time the modification was made, the design might have been unfinished or misunderstood. Ethan's slow adjustments over several seasons were gradually refining the idea. 8 years later, the tractor was still running. Still pulling wagons during harvest, still planting small sections of fields each spring, and still quietly burning far less fuel than anyone expected. Neighbors rarely noticed. Most farmers assumed Ethan simply preferred old machines. But Ethan knew something different was happening. Inside that engine, a forgotten experiment from decades earlier was slowly proving itself. And after 12 years of small adjustments, careful records, and patient observation, Ethan finally had enough evidence to show someone else. Someone who laughed the day he bought the tractor for $600, the John Deere dealer. By the time 12 years had passed, the old tractor had become such a normal part of Ethan Miller's farm that most people barely noticed it anymore. It still worked the same fields it had since the first year Ethan rebuilt it. Planting in the spring, pulling wagons during harvest, occasionally running the grain auger beside the bins. From the outside, nothing about the machine looked special. The paint had faded even more over time. The seat cushion had been replaced twice. One of the headlights had stopped working years earlier. But inside the engine, something very different had been quietly happening. Ethan's notebooks had grown thick. Each planting season, each harvest, each tank of diesel. 12 years of records sat on a shelf in the workshop, and the numbers were impossible to ignore. The tractor consistently used 30 to 35% less fuel than other tractors in the same horsepower range. For a small farm like Ethan's, that difference mattered. Over 12 years, the savings had quietly added up to several $1,000s in fuel costs. But Ethan still had one unanswered question. Was the unusual engine modification actually responsible for it, or had he simply convinced himself that it was? That question remained in the back of his mind for years, until one afternoon during late harvest season. A pickup truck pulled slowly into Ethan's farmyard and parked near the equipment shed. The man stepping out of the truck looked familiar. It was the same John Deere dealer who had been standing beside the tractor the day Ethan bought it at auction. The dealer had been visiting farms across the county that week, checking on customers and discussing new equipment orders. While walking through Ethan's yard, he stopped suddenly when he saw the old tractor parked beside the barn. For a moment, he just stared at it. Then he laughed slightly. "I can't believe that thing is still running," he said. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he walked into the workshop and returned with one of the old notebooks. He handed it to the dealer. The man flipped through the pages slowly. Fuel logs, field hours, season after season of records. At first, the dealer seemed confused. Then his expression changed. He walked over to the tractor and opened the engine panel, the same panel Ethan had looked inside 12 years earlier at the auction. For several minutes, the dealer said nothing. He leaned closer, studying the modified component near the fuel system. Finally, he stepped back, looking both surprised and thoughtful, because the design he was seeing inside that old tractor looked strangely familiar. It resembled an experimental fuel efficiency concept that manufacturers had quietly tested decades ago, but never widely released. And somehow, without realizing it at the time, Ethan Miller had spent 12 years finishing the experiment.
News in farming communities rarely spreads through announcements. It spreads through conversations. Within a few weeks of the dealer's visit, word about Ethan's old tractor began circulating quietly around the county. At first, it was mentioned casually during conversations at the grain elevator. Someone would say, "You know that old tractor Ethan Miller runs?" And then the story would follow. The same tractor people had laughed about at the auction years earlier, the one that supposedly wasn't worth repairing, the one bought for $600. Farmers began hearing about the fuel numbers Ethan had been recording for years, 30% less diesel. For anyone who worked long hours in the field, that detail caught attention immediately. Fuel was one of the largest operating costs on any farm. Curiosity slowly replaced the earlier jokes. A few neighbors stopped by Ethan's farm during the winter to take a closer look at the tractor. Most of them expected to see something dramatic under the hood, but when Ethan opened the engine panel, they were surprised. There was no futuristic equipment, no complicated electronics, just a small, carefully machined component inside the fuel system and a few adjustments that had been refined slowly over many seasons. Farmers studied it quietly. Some asked questions. Others simply nodded and thought about it. One of the same neighbors who had laughed about the tractor years earlier stood beside Ethan in the workshop one evening and shook his head slowly. "All that time, and we thought you were wasting your winters fixing junk." Ethan didn't respond much to comments like that. He simply explained what he had learned along the way. Because to him, the story wasn't really about proving anyone wrong. It was about something much simpler. Sometimes an idea just needs time, and sometimes the quietest experiments are the ones that change the most minds. Over the next few years, the story of Ethan Miller's old tractor slowly became part of local farming conversation, not as some kind of miracle machine, but as an example of something farmers had almost forgotten: patience. At first, only a few curious neighbors tried experimenting with their own older tractors. During the winter months, small groups of farmers began meeting in workshops and barns around the county, studying fuel systems and comparing notes. They looked at injector timing, airflow adjustments, small mechanical modifications that older engines allowed, but modern machines rarely did. None of them copied Ethan's tractor exactly. Every machine was different. But the idea behind it spread quietly. Instead of immediately replacing aging equipment, some farmers began repairing it and studying it more carefully. Older tractors that once would have been sold for scrap started showing up in barns again. Even the local John Deere dealer noticed the shift. He started seeing farmers bring in older parts for inspection rather than trading machines in for newer models. For Ethan, life on the farm didn't change very much. His fields were still the same 140 acres his grandfather had planted decades earlier. The same tractor still worked those fields each season, just as it always had. But the real legacy of that $600 auction purchase wasn't the machine itself. It was the quiet reminder that sometimes the most valuable ideas in farming don't arrive through brand new equipment.
Sometimes they've been sitting inside an old machine for years, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. Years later, if you drove past Ethan Miller's farm during planting season, you might still see that same old John Deere tractor moving slowly across the fields. From a distance, nothing about it would look unusual. It doesn't have satellite guidance, no digital screens inside the cab, no bright dealership decals announcing a new model year, just faded green paint and an engine that has been turning for decades. Most people passing by would never guess the story behind it. But for the farmers who remember the auction years earlier, the tractor carries a quiet lesson. Farming has always been full of new ideas, bigger machines, and faster technology. Yet sometimes the most important discoveries happen in a slower way. A farmer noticing a small detail, taking the time to ask why something works, and being patient enough to keep experimenting long after others have lost interest. Because the difference between a mistake and a breakthrough is often simple. It's the person willing to look twice at something everyone else has already dismissed.